The mud of April was a different kind of enemy than the snow of January. It was thick, hungry, and smelled of awakening earth and exhaustion. Calving season had arrived like a tidal wave, and for Levi and Kara, sleep became a luxury they could no longer afford. The action started at 3 in the morning under a moon as sharp as a scythe. A young heifer was in trouble, a breech birth. Levi was up to his elbows in birth fluids and grit, his muscles screaming as he tried to reposition the calf. The heifer was panicked, kicking out with a blind primal fear. "Hold her head, Kara." Levi grunted, his face slick with sweat despite the midnight chill. She didn't hesitate. She threw her weight against the heifer's neck, her voice a low, steady hum that somehow cut through the animal's agony. "Easy, girl, easy now. We're almost there." With a final rib-cracking heave, the calf slid free into the straw. For a terrifying 10 seconds, it didn't breathe. Levi cleared the snout, slapping the small ribs, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his chest. Then, a wet, ragged cough. The calf's head lifted, ears twitching. Life had won again. They sat there in the straw, covered in the mess of the miracle, breathing as hard as the heifer. In the flickering light of the lantern, Levi looked at Kara. Her hair was a wild nest, her face was smeared with dirt, and she looked absolutely beautiful. They were a team. They moved like 2 gears in a clock, anticipating each other's needs without a single word. But the peace of the dawn was broken by the arrival of a black automobile, a mechanical scar against the rolling green of the hills. Richard Thornton, the banker from Casper, stepped out, looking polished and painfully out of place. Levi met him in the small ranch office, the smell of the barn still clinging to his skin. He knew what was coming. You didn't get a personal visit from a banker in 1925 unless the world was ending. "Cattle prices have bottomed out, Levi," Thornton said, spreading ledgers across the desk like funeral shrouds. "Way down from last fall. Between the storm damage, the fencing repairs, and the hay you lost in the blizzard, you're hitting your credit limit hard." Levi stared at the numbers. They didn't lie. "How bad?" "You need a perfect calf crop and a miracle at the autumn auctions. Or you'll have to sell off land to cover the debt. At least a quarter section, maybe more." The ghost of Levi's father flickered in the corner of the room. The land his father had lost. History was trying to repeat itself, not through gambling this time, but through the sheer, indifferent cruelty of the market. "There's another issue," Thornton continued, his voice devoid of malice but heavy with reality. "Your summer help, the woman. The bank can't justify the expense of a hired hand when the numbers are this thin. You have to let her go." Levi's jaw set into a line of iron. "That's my business. It's the bank's business when it's our money keeping the lights on." After Thornton left, the silence of the ranch felt different. It felt fragile. Levi found Kara at the south pasture, mending a section of wire. She looked up, her smile fading the moment she saw his face. She knew. She'd seen that look on her own father's face before the end. "I can't keep you through the summer, Kara," Levi said, the words tasting like ash. "Prices are down. The bank is. They're squeezing." Kara's face went carefully, devastatingly blank. She didn't cry, she didn't argue. She just gripped the wire cutters until her knuckles turned white. "I understand. I'll be out by the end of the month." "It's not what I want." Levi stepped toward her, his voice breaking. "It doesn't matter what we want, Dawson. The land doesn't care about want." She turned back to the fence, hammering a staple with 3 precise, violent strikes. But that evening, she didn't pack her bag. Instead, she knocked on his door and walked into the kitchen with a hand-drawn map. "I have a proposal," she said, spreading the paper on the table. "My father's ranch. 2 counties over. 160 acres. It's got a solid house and a barn that needs work, but the water source is the best in the territory. It's worthless without cattle. Your ranch is struggling because of overhead and debt. Levi looked at the map. What are you saying? Stake me. Give me 25 heifers from your surplus stock. I'll move them to my land. We run both ranches as one. We share the equipment, share the labor, share the risk. We combine the herds. One operation, two properties. We'd be stronger together than the bank could ever be against us alone. Levi stared at her. That's an incredible risk, Kara. If the prices don't recover, we both lose everything. I'd be betting my land on your land. Yes, she said, her creekwater eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate hope. But maybe losing everything once doesn't mean you have to be afraid forever. I'm tired of running, Levi. I believe in good bones. Your ranch has them. Mine does too. Together we can build something that outlasts the bankers. Levi looked at the map, then at her. He thought about his 20 years of careful, lonely safety. He thought about the fences he'd built around his heart. Partners? He asked, his voice low. Partners, she whispered. He rode out to her father's ranch the next day to see it for himself. It was a wreck, weeds choking the fields, porch boards warped, the house crying out for paint. But as he walked through the empty rooms, he saw what she meant. The structure was sound. The bones were good. He could see her here. He could see them here. He found her sitting on the porch steps of the abandoned house, watching the sunset. You came to see if I was crazy, she said. I came to see what I'm investing my life in. Levi sat beside her. I spent my whole life making sure I never needed anyone, Kara. Needing someone gives them the power to destroy you. I've been terrified of that since I was 19. I know, she said, leaning her shoulder against his. My father needed his herd. When he lost it, he died, but never needing anything. Never building anything that matters because you're afraid to lose it. That's just a slower way of dying, isn't it? Levi looked at her, this woman who had ridden through a killer storm to save a stranger. He realized then that he didn't just need her help with the cattle. He needed her to remind him how to live. Let's do it, he said. The partnership. All of it. The following months were a blur of transformation. They moved cattle between properties, repaired the old homestead, and fought the market with everything they had. The neighboring ranchers stopped gossiping and started watching in awe as two failing operations turned into a thriving machine. Even the banker, Thornton, eventually returned, eyes wide as he reviewed their combined books. I'll be damned, he muttered. You actually pulled it off. But the real victory wasn't in the ledgers. It happened in late August, under a gentle rain that smelled of sweet grass. They were in the barn of the newly restored homestead when the first calf of their official partnership was born, a sturdy red heifer with a white face. Kara turned to him, her face radiant with joy, raindrops glistening in her hair like diamonds. We did it, Levi. We actually did it. Levi couldn't hold back anymore. He reached out, cupping her face in his scarred, calloused hands. You saved more than my cattle, Kara Morrison. You gave me back a future I thought was gone forever. When he kissed her, the world outside, the bank, the storms, the ghosts of their fathers simply faded away. She tasted of rain and hope, and the way she held onto him told him she was finally done running. Stay, he whispered against her lips. Not in the foreman's cabin, not as a hired hand. Stay with me. Build this with me. What will the neighbors say? She teased, though her eyes were shining with tears. They'll say we're partners, Levi said, a smile finally breaking across his face. And they'll say I'm the luckiest fool in Wyoming. They stood in the doorway of the barn, watching the rain bless the land. Behind them, the new calf nursed peacefully. Ahead of them, the road was still long and the winters would still be cold. But for the first time in 20 years, Levi Dawson wasn't afraid of the storm. He had someone to ride it out with, and that was the only miracle he ever really needed. The fourth morning arrived not with a bang, but with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a world buried in a pristine, suffocating white. Levi walked toward the barn, his breath hitching in the sub-zero air, expecting to see the usual plume of smoke from the tackroom stove, or the rhythmic swing of a lantern dot instead. He found the barn doors slightly ajar, whistling in the light. "Breeze, Kara?" he called out. No answer. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The cattle were quiet, their rhythmic chewing the only sound in the vast space. Then he saw it. A dark shape slumped in the center of the aisle, right between the Hereford stalls. His heart didn't just skip, it stopped. In 3 strides, he was across the dirt floor, dropping to his knees in the straw. Kara lay on her side, her face pressed against the cold earth. Her skin wasn't just pale. It was translucent, mapped with a spiderweb of blue veins. When he touched her shoulder, the heat radiating off her was terrifying. She was burning up in a room that was barely above freezing. "Kara, wake up!" He shook her gently, then with more urgency. Her head lolled back, her eyes fluttering open for a fraction of a second creek water eyes, now clouded with a terrifying, glassy haze. She didn't see him. She was somewhere else, somewhere far away from the Wyoming snow. When Levi lifted her, he was struck by how little she actually weighed. She had worked through a killer storm with the strength of a titan, but in his arms, she felt as fragile as a bird with a broken wing. She had given everything she had to his cattle, to his land, until there was nothing left for herself. He carried her to the main house, kicking the door open and heading straight for the guest room he'd offered her days before. He stripped off his own heavy coat and began a frantic, desperate routine. He piled every wool blanket he owned over her shaking form. He sprinted to the kitchen, stoking the fire until the cast-iron stove glowed cherry red. He boiled water, his mind racing with a fear he hadn't felt since he was a boy watching the bankmen tally his father's debts. The fever lasted 3 agonizing days, in the quiet of the house. Kara's defenses finally vanished, replaced by the jagged fragments of a broken life. Levi sat by her bed, cooling her forehead with damp claws, listening as her story spilled out in delirious whispers. "The grass. It's turning to dust," she moaned one night, her fingers clutching the quilt, as if it were a lifeline. June was too hot, July was worse. Papa said the rain would come. He promised, but the creek just stopped singing. Levi held her hand, the hand with the wire scars, and felt a lump form in his throat. "The trucks came in September," she whispered, a tear tracking through the sweat on her temple. "I watched them load the heifers, every calf. Papa looked at them like they were his children leaving for war. The last one went in October. He died 3 days later. The doctor said his heart gave out, but I know. He died because there was nothing left to listen to." The land went silent. Levi didn't speak. He just watched her. He had lived his life believing that losing everything was a result of weakness, of gambling, of drinking, of not being man enough to hold on. But hearing her, he realized there was a different kind of loss. The kind that comes from loving something too much, from tying your soul to the rain and the soil, only to have the sky turn its back on you. On the second night, when her fever spiked so high she began to thrash, Levi found himself talking back. Not because he thought she could hear him, but because the silence of the house was becoming unbearable. "My father didn't wait for a drought," Levi said quietly, his voice a low rumble in the dimly lit room. "He was a gambler. Cards, horses. The weather didn't matter. He'd bet his soul if a dealer would take the action. He lost our ranch when I was 19. I spent 24 years building this place, Kara. Every fence you see out there is a wall I built to keep the world out. I swore I'd never need help. I swore I'd never be vulnerable to another man's weakness." He looked at her flushed face, her breathing ragged and thin. "And then you rode out of a blizzard. A miracle on a gray horse. You saved what I couldn't save alone. And now here you are, dying in my guest room because you were too proud to ask for a warm meal. On the third night, the fever broke. Levi had fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed, his neck kinked at a painful angle. He woke to the soft, golden light of a Wyoming morning filtering through the curtains. He felt a gaze on him. He looked up, and there she was. Her eyes were clear, the haze gone, though she looked like she'd been through a war. "Your cattle," she rasped, her voice barely a thread of sound. Levi let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 72 hours. "Safe, all 300. They're eating hay and wondering where the woman who speaks their language went." A genuine, fragile smile touched her lips. Then she looked around the room, realization dawning. "I'm in your house. You collapsed in the barn. You worked yourself into a pneumonia fever. You've been out for 3 days." Her smile vanished, replaced by that familiar iron-jawed pride. She tried to sit up, her face crumpling with the effort. "I have to get to the barn. I don't take charity, Dawson." "Sit down before I pin you down," Levi ordered, his voice stern but lacking any real bite. "It's not charity. It's a medical necessity. And we're past the point of pretending you're just a drifter. I know about your father. I know about the ranch." She froze, her eyes searching his. "What did I say?" "Enough to know we're the same kind of broken," Levi said softly. He reached out and took her hand. This time she didn't pull away. Over the next week, as she regained her strength, they reached an uneasy truce. Levi discovered that Kara was just as stubborn in recovery as she was in a storm. She insisted on earning her keep the moment she could walk to the kitchen. "Stay through calving season," Levi said one evening as they sat at the table. "April and May, it's the hardest time of the year. I need a hand who knows what they're doing, and you're the best I've ever seen. I'll pay you fair wages, skilled labor wages." Kara looked at him, her suspicion warring with her need for a home. "Where would I stay?" "The foreman's cabin. It's been empty for years. It needs some paint and the porch is sagging, but the roof is tight." "I pay rent," she countered immediately. Levi bit back a grin. "Fine, $10 a month." "20, she snapped. "I'm negotiating for my dignity, Dawson. I stay in that cabin. I work for wages, I pay rent. Nothing given, nothing owed. That's the only way I stay." "Deal," Levi said, offering his hand. Her grip was weak, but the iron was back in her eyes. The peace didn't last long. A few days later, a dust cloud on the horizon signaled the arrival of neighbors. Tom and Eleanor Patterson, along with the local doctor and his wife, rode up to the porch. News traveled fast in a small ranching community, and a woman staying on a bachelor's ranch was better than any newspaper. "Heard you weathered the storm." "Levi," Tom said, his eyes darting toward the barn where Kara was visible, mending a bridle. "Also heard you've got that company." "This is Kara Morrison," Levi said, his voice dropping an octave. "She's a skilled ranch hand. She's working for me through calving season." Eleanor Patterson's eyebrows shot up toward her bonnet. "Working? For you? And she's staying ... where, exactly?" "The foreman's cabin," Levi replied, his jaw tightening. "Levi, people will talk," Eleanor said, her tone as sharp as a January wind. "It's not proper. A woman like that, alone on a ranch with a man like you." "Let them talk," Levi interrupted. The word surprised even him. He had spent his whole life building a reputation of cold, sterile respectability. But looking at the way Kara stood in the barn doorway, head held high, he felt a surge of protective fury. "Miss Morrison saved my livelihood while the rest of you were huddled by your stoves. If anyone has a problem with how I run my ranch, they can tell it to the wind." After the neighbors left, he found Kara packing her canvas bag in the barn. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. I won't have them destroying your name because of me. My name isn't your concern, Levi said, stepping into her space. It should be. I know what they'll call me. I've heard it before. I won't be the reason you lose the respect you worked 20 years for. Kara, look at me. He waited until her creek water eyes met his. You saved me. Not just the cattle, but the man. Anyone who can't see the truth of what you are, the skill, the heart, the strength, isn't worth my time. I'm tired of building fences to keep people out. I'm ready to build something else. Kara's hand stilled on the bag. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of a storm or the silence of a wall. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of two people deciding to trust each other. Why? She whispered. Why do you care? Levi didn't have a scripted answer. He only had the truth. Because for the first time in 20 years, the sky is the right color. And I think you're the reason why. She didn't leave. And as the snow began to melt, revealing the first hints of green, the ranch began to change. But as they soon discovered, the world doesn't let you build something beautiful without trying to tear it down one more time. The storm didn't just linger, it entrenched itself. For 3 days, the world outside the southern barn was a screaming white void, a place where time and direction had no meaning. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet hay, the pungent heat of 300 cattle, and a tension that felt as sharp as the ice rattling against the barn's cedar siding. Levi had lived on this land for over 2 decades, mostly in a silence he had carefully curated. He liked the quiet. It was predictable. It didn't ask questions, and it didn't judge. But the silence Kara brought with her was different. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a fortified wall. Every morning, Levi would struggle through the waist-deep drifts from the main house to the barn, his lungs burning from the frozen air, only to find that Kara was already awake and working. It rankled him. He was the master of this ranch, yet she moved through the chores with a ghostly efficiency that made him feel like a guest in his own barn. She had already broken the inch-thick ice in the water troughs with a sledgehammer, her breath hitching in steady rhythmic plumes. She had already walked the perimeter, checking the latches on the heavy doors. On the second morning, the wind was so violent it felt like it might pick up the entire structure and hurl it into the next county. Levi arrived with 2 thermals of coffee and a cloth-wrapped bundle of lard biscuits. Still warm from his wood stove. Kara was in the far corner, her hand resting on the flank of a Hereford heifer that looked peaked. She was whispering to the animal, not words exactly, but a low, melodic vibration that seemed to anchor the nervous beast to the straw. Eat, Levi said, his voice cracking from disuse. He held out a biscuit. She didn't look up immediately. She finished her murmur, gave the heifer a final authoritative pat, and only then did she turn. She accepted the food with a curt nod. As she took the biscuit, Levi noticed her hands. They weren't the hands of a drifter or a casual laborer. They were mapped with old scars, pale, jagged lines from barbed wire, and the deep, permanent calluses of a life spent pulling weight. You know cattle, Levi remarked, leaning against a support beam and watching her. Most hands I hire spend the first week just trying not to get stepped on. You move like you're reading their minds. Kara took a sip of the bitter coffee, her eyes, those unsettling creek water eyes, fixed on the swirling snow outside a high vent. My father was a rancher, she said. Was? The word hung in the air like a baited hook. Levi saw her jaw tighten, a micro-expression of pain that she suppressed with practiced ease. He knew that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror every day after the bank took his family's land. It was the look of someone who had watched their world burn and was still standing in the ashes. Was, she repeated, her voice flat. Levi didn't push. He knew better. In the West, a man's or a woman's past was their own business until they chose to share it. Prying was a good way to get a cold shoulder or a hot lead. Instead, they worked. They worked through the howling day in a near-total silence that was more exhausting than the labor itself. It was a strange dance. They moved around each other like two predators sharing the same territory. When a hay bale needed shifting, she was already there, grabbing one end. When a calf looked colicky, she pointed it out before he could even open his mouth. She showed him things about his own herd he hadn't noticed. A subtle limp in a bull, a specific way the wind was whistling. Through a gap in the eastern wall that needed plugging, she was a mirror of himself, and Levi hated it. He hated how much he saw of his own stubborn pride in her. As the light began to fail on that second evening, the storm reached a new crescendo. The barn groaned under the pressure of the snow piling up on the roof. Levi looked at the small, cramped tack room at the far end of the barn. It had a small wood-burning stove and a cot, but it was hardly a place for a human being to spend a 3-day blizzard. "Come up to the house," Levi said, trying to sound casual, though the offer felt heavy in his chest. "You can't stay in this barn all night. The wind's picking up, and the temperature is dropping into the negatives. I've got a guest room. It's warm." Kara didn't even pause in her task of cleaning a saddle. "I'm used to rougher." "I appreciate the offer, Dawson, but the tack room's fine. I've got a stove. I've got a cot. I've slept in worse places than a barn filled with 300 heaters." "It's not charity," Levi snapped, his frustration finally bubbling over. "It's common sense. You're shivering, even if you're trying to hide it." She looked at him then, and for a second, the wall cracked. He saw the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion behind her eyes. But then the iron returned. "I stay here. I don't owe anyone for a roof over my head. Not you, not anyone." She disappeared into the tack room and closed the door with a quiet, devastating finality. Levi stood in the center of the barn, surrounded by the low lowing of his cattle and the scream of the wind. He felt a strange, nagging sensation in his chest, a mixture of admiration and profound irritation. He walked back to his empty house, the wind nearly knocking him off his feet. Inside, the rooms felt too large, the silence too heavy. For 20 years, he had convinced himself that this was peace. Now it just felt like isolation. By the third day, the storm began to lose its fury. The sky shifted from that horrific green to a pale, washed-out gray. The sun was trying to break through. A weak white disk in a sea of clouds. Levi found Kara in the tack room doorway. She was pale, her movements sluggish, her hand trembling as she held a mug of water. She was swaying on her feet, the 3 days of non-stop labor and freezing conditions finally catching up to her. "You look like hell," Levi said, his voice gentler than he intended. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Sweet talker, I mean it. The storm's breaking. Come to the house. I've got stew on the stove. Real food, not biscuits and cold water. You've earned it." She leaned against the doorframe, her eyes closing for a brief second. "I told you, I don't need charity. You've got your cattle safe. My work here is done. I'll be moving on. To nowhere in particular. Pride is a fine thing, Kara, but you can't eat it and it won't keep you warm." Levi stepped closer. "At least let me pay you for the work. 3 days of skilled labor, that's not a gift. It's wages. Any man I hired would get the same, and they wouldn't have done half the job you did." "I don't want your money," she whispered, her voice losing its edge. She turned back to gather her few belongings, a worn canvas bag that looked like it had seen more miles than most horses. "Why?" Levi's voice rose. "Why did you ride into a killer storm to save a stranger's herd if you won't let that stranger even say thank you? What are you trying to prove?" She stopped. She turned to face him, and the weight of her gaze was almost physical. "Because your cattle were dying, Dawson. That's reason enough. In this world, things die so easily. If you have the chance to stop it, you do it. It doesn't have to be a transaction. Through the barn's main doors, a single beam of actual sunlight pierced through the thinning clouds, hitting the straw and making the ice crystals glitter like diamonds. The storm was over. Levi realized with a jolt of unexpected panic that she was actually going to leave. She was going to ride out of his life as mysteriously as she had entered it, leaving him with his 300 cattle and his crushing, perfect loneliness. "At least stay until tomorrow," he heard himself say. The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. "The roads will be impassable today. The drifts are 10 feet high in the draws. My fences are down in at least 2 places. And I've got a shed roof that collapsed. I could use the help. One more day. Professional wages. Then you go to nowhere with a full stomach and a rested horse." Kara studied his face. Her creek water eyes searched his features, looking for the catch, looking for the weakness. Whatever she saw there, perhaps a reflection of her own desperate need for a moment of peace, made her shoulders drop just an inch. "One more day," she agreed, "then I'm gone." That night, for the first time in years, Levi didn't fall asleep immediately. He lay in his bed, listening to the silence of the house, which now felt different. It was the silence of anticipation. He thought about the woman sleeping in his barn, wondered what kind of ghosts could drive someone to be so fiercely, dangerously independent. He wondered why it mattered to him so much. He didn't know that by dawn, the choice of whether she stayed or stayed wouldn't be hers to make. The coffee in Levi Dawson's hand wasn't just cold. It was a dead weight, a forgotten relic of a morning that had started with a warning written in the heavens. He stood at the window of the ranch house he had built with his own 2 calloused hands, staring at a horizon that shouldn't exist. The sky was the wrong color. It wasn't the soft rose of a Wyoming dawn or the deep blue of a clear winter day. It was a sickly, bruised greenish gray, the color of a terminal illness or a shallow grave dot in 43 years of battling this land. Levi had learned that the earth always warned you before it tried to kill you. You just had to be smart enough to listen. Most men read newspapers. Levi read the tilt of the grass, the scent of the ozone, and the way the birds vanished long before the first flake fell. This storm wasn't just coming. It was hunting. He tightened his grip on the mug until his knuckles turned as white as the snow he knew was coming. This ranch, this dirt, every single fence post and buried water line, it was more than a business. It was his fortress. He'd built it alone, driven by a ghost that had haunted him since he was 19 years old. His father, a man who loved the roll of the dice more than the roof over his family's head, had gambled away their original homestead in a single night of drunken weakness. Levi had watched the bankmen come. He had watched his mother cry until her eyes were hollow pits. That day, a lesson was carved into his very marrow. Trust only yourself. Need no one. If you don't depend on a soul, no one's weakness can ever take what's yours. The first gust hit like a physical blow. The old ranch house groaned, the windows rattling in their frames as if some invisible beast was trying to claw its way inside. Within minutes, the world outside simply ceased to exist. The barn, which sat barely 70 yards away, vanished behind a wall of white so thick it felt solid. It wasn't falling snow. It was a sideways assault, sheets of ice cutting through the air like jagged glass. "The Herefords," Levi whispered, his voice sounding thin against the screaming wind. 300 head of cattle, his entire life's work. They were scattered across the south pasture, exposed and vulnerable. If they panicked, and they would drift with the wind, blind and terrified, until they hit a fence line or fell into a frozen draw. They would pile up, one on top of the other, freezing in a mass of brown and white until the spring thaw revealed the extent of his ruin. Everything he had sacrificed for, every year of loneliness he had endured to ensure his security, was out there, dying. Levi didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat, jammed his hat low, and stepped out into the maw of the storm. Cold didn't just touch him, it violated him. It found every microscopic gap in his clothing, stealing the heat from his skin with greedy, invisible fingers. He could barely breathe, the air so thick with ice it felt like inhaling needles. He fought his way to the stable, moving by memory and touch. Inside, the air was slightly calmer, but the tension was thick. His mare, a sturdy bay named Cinder, was already frantic. She fought the saddle, her ears pinned flat against her skull, her eyes rolling. She knew, "Easy, girl. We're going to lose them all if we don't move," Levi grunted, his fingers fumbling with the cinches as the cold began to numb his joints. He pushed Cinder out into the white hell. The wind screamed a high-pitched, dissonant note that drowned out the sound of the mare's hooves. He couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. He navigated by the tilt of the land, feeling the rise and fall of the hills he had walked 1,000 times. He found them near the southern boundary, a chaotic, shifting mass of fear. The cattle were running, their heads low, their breath coming in ragged plumes that froze instantly. He tried to turn them, to guide them toward the lee of the big southern barn, but his shouts were swallowed by the gale. Cinder stumbled, her legs sinking into a hidden drift. "Come on, move," Levi yelled, spurring her. But the storm was a living thing now, a white tide that refused to be tamed. The cattle were breaking, splitting into smaller groups, heading for the treacherous draws where the snow would bury them alive. In that moment, Levi felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the icy realization of failure. He had done everything right. He had worked harder than any man he knew. He had avoided every trap his father had fallen into. And yet, here he was, watching his world vanish into a chaotic white void. He was helpless. Then he saw her dot at first. He thought his mind was finally snapping under the strain of the frost. A dark figure appeared through the blizzard, moving with a grace that felt impossible, almost supernatural. She was on horseback, but she didn't seem to be fighting the storm. She seemed to be a part of it. Her horse, a powerful gray, moved through the drifts as if it were a Sunday morning in July, responding to the slightest shift of her weight. She didn't shout. She didn't wave her arms like a madman. She simply was. Levi watched, stunned into a temporary paralysis as she began to weave through the panicked herd. The cattle didn't scatter when she approached. They turned toward her. It was as if she spoke a language they understood, a silent, ancient dialect of authority and calm. She wasn't chasing them. She was drawing them, flowing around the edges of the herd like water, guiding the river of brown and white back toward the south. Levi remounted, his heart hammering against his ribs. He followed her, but he was more of a witness than an assistant. He watched her read the land beneath the drifts, anticipating where the cattle would break before they even knew it themselves. She moved with an uncanny skill, positioning herself with a surgical precision that Levi had never seen in all his years of ranching. She was a shadow in the whiteout, a wild thing that the storm couldn't touch Dot by the time they reached the massive doors of the southern barn. The miracle was complete. All 300 head were inside, huddling together, their heat beginning to take the edge off the internal chill. Inside the barn, the silence felt like a physical weight after the roar of the wind. The woman was already off her horse. She didn't look at him. She was unharnessing her exhausted mount, her movements economical and practiced. She checked the horse's legs for ice balls, her hands moving with a mixture of authority and a strange, deep-seated gentleness. "Who are you?" Levi's voice came out as a ragged rasp. His face was caked in ice, his beard a frozen mask. She looked up then. For the first time, Levi saw her face. Her eyes were the color of creek water in late autumn, clear, cold, and incredibly deep. She didn't smile. She didn't look relieved. She looked like someone who had just finished a mundane chore. "Does it matter?" she asked. Her voice was steady, lacking the tremor of exhaustion he felt in his own limbs. "You just saved 300 head of cattle," Levi said, stepping closer, his boots heavy with frozen mud. "You saved ... everything." "They needed saving," she replied simply. She turned back to her horse, dismissing him with a finality that stung his pride. Levi stood there, the master of a ranch that would have been a graveyard if not for the stranger. He watched her work, noting the way she handled the tack, the way she checked the cattle with a professional assessment. This wasn't some drifter who had picked up a pitchfork for the first time last season. This was a woman who had been born to this life, who carried the weight of the land in the set of her shoulders. "At least tell me your name," Levi pressed. She paused, a brush in her hand. She looked at him again, those creek water eyes searching his face as if looking for something she wasn't sure he possessed. "Kara," she said. "That's it? Just Kara? That's all you need to know for now. The storm isn't done yet, Dawson. You've got feed stored in the loft, right? We need to shift the bales before the wind shifts and blocks the hatch." She moved past him toward the cattle, already assessing which heifers were shivering too much, which ones were dehydrated. She was already working his ranch as if it were her own. And for the first time in his life, Levi Dawson found himself following someone else's lead as the wind roared outside, threatening to tear the roof from the rafters. Levi looked at this mysterious woman and realized that the wrong color of the sky hadn't been a warning of death. It had been a herald of something far more complicated.